saw the vehicle, and then also heard what had happened.
It's a very quiet neighborhood. We get very few calls, so it's very surprising to all of us.
That was just the beginning of a shocking chain of events. Behind that quiet car was a story with many layers about youth, about unfulfilled dreams, and about unexpected secrets. Brayla Stone, 17 years old, is a black transgender girl living her youth with many unfulfilled dreams. Lively, intelligent, and full of courage, she often shares her image on social networks with a confident smile. But at the same time, in another world, the name Trevone Miller, 20 years old, appears with mystery and distance. Few people know that between these two people there is a silent connection, bringing with it emotions, choices, and unpredictable consequences. Arkansas, summer 2020, a quiet state where serious cases are rarely mentioned. But on that day, the atmosphere was torn apart by an abnormality that no one wanted to name. People around the area were in an uproar. Social networks passed around photos of a car on the side of the road, and the name Brayla began to be associated with an unsolved mystery. What did she do there? Why that day? And what really happened inside that car? On June 24, 2020, just a day before things went strangely quiet, Brayla Stone was still on social media with familiar statuses. Nothing in her words suggested uncertainty or anxiety. She was still talking about the things she loved, still smiling, still sharing pictures of herself, confident that tomorrow would continue as usual. Later that afternoon, Brayla texted a close friend that she had to go somewhere, but didn't specify what it was. She didn't share her destination, nor did she mention who she was meeting. The message was sent at 5:12 p.m., after which Brayla's phone continued to work, but there was little noticeable network activity. From later data, it was determined that at approximately 6:30 p.m., Brayla was at a meeting point in the Sherwood area, less than a 20-minute drive from Little Rock. It was a dirt road near a sparsely populated area, quiet, low traffic, and virtually devoid of security cameras. Through cell phone tracking and location data, it was known that she stopped there and did not leave again after 7 p.m. What happened between 7 p.m. and the early morning hours of June 25 was a series of blanks that were never completely filled. At the same time, Trevone Miller was also determined to have left his North Little Rock residence at approximately 6:20 p.m. Cell phone and GPS data showed that his phone traveled in the direction of Sherwood and stopped in the area near where Brayla was at approximately 6:55 p.m. No one in the area reported any unusual noises that night. Neighbors along the trail claimed they had not seen anything unusual, only that it was a hot evening, with few people out and about. The quietness of the area had allowed for something to happen quietly, unnoticed. Notably, at around 8:14 p.m., an anonymous social media post was discovered, with the content later drawing the attention of the online community. The poster claimed to know of unusual behavior coming soon and mentioned a name associated with Brayla. However, no one had yet put the pieces of information together. There was no message from Brayla after 7 p.m. No one heard her call, no one saw her leave the car. It was an area of absolute silence, and in that silence, any trace of her seemed to have been temporarily lost to time. The night passed without any alarm. By the early morning of June 25, Brayla's car was still in the same spot, in the rising light of the early morning sun. No one knew that the silence of that early morning was the result of a silent but irreversible chain of events. The incident was never discovered, but the final steps of both Brayla and Trevone were clearly etched on the GPS map. Early in the morning of June 25, 2020, the Arkansas sky was a pale blue, as quiet as usual. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the leaves, shining on the deserted road. No one expected that this very silence was covering something no one wanted to believe was real. At around 6:45 a.m., a resident living near the Brookswood Trail in Sherwood went out for a walk as usual. This is a suburban road with little traffic, usually frequented only by locals. This location is about a 15-minute drive from downtown Little Rock, surrounded by trees and low grass, creating a feeling of separation from the urban space. When passing a small turn, this person came across a silver car parked on the side of the road, an image that was not unusual, but something made him stop. The car had been sitting there since yesterday, but now it looked as if no one had ever left. The passenger side window was open a crack and sunlight was streaming in. There was no movement, no sound, just silence. At first, the man moved closer to get a better look, but after a few seconds, a sense of unease made him stop, take out his phone, and call 911. The call came in at 6:53 a.m. The caller described a car that had been sitting for too long and something was wrong inside, though he wasn't sure what. Less than 10 minutes later, a Sherwood police patrol car arrived on the scene. They approached cautiously, taking note of the exterior of the car, and quickly cordoned off the area to preserve any evidence they might have. When the police looked inside through the glass, they noticed a still image that had not changed since the night before. The interior of the car appeared intact, with no signs of displacement. A few personal items were on the passenger seat, and a duffel bag was neatly placed in the back seat. More importantly, it was the position of the occupants, unmoving and unresponsive, that immediately triggered the emergency response. The police called in backup and paramedics. Within 30 minutes of the initial call, the area was cordoned off, and an initial inspection was conducted. Although nothing could be concluded at that point, everyone present sensed that this was no ordinary situation. Every glance exchanged between the responding officers was tinged with caution. Every detail, from where the car was parked to the condition of the contents inside, was recorded line by line. The car's ownership information was verified through the license plate, and the name Brayla Stone appeared for the first time in the police records that morning. However, at 7:40 a.m., no one at the scene knew the true identity of the person inside. She was only 17 years old, and until then, everything was just a pile of suspicions. This discovery, which began from a seemingly normal walking habit, became the starting point for a long series of investigations, shaking the local community and the whole country. And from that moment, an investigation began quietly but urgently, with each small detail gradually revealing connections that no one had noticed before. The discovery of the car on the morning of June 25, 2020, not only opened up an unusual crime scene, but also laid the first bricks for a long, quiet, but urgent investigation. Within hours, the identity of the girl in the car was determined to be Brayla Stone, 17 years old, a teenager living in Arkansas, known in the community as a brave young person, true to herself. After confirming her personal information through the license plate and medical records, the police began to review her most recent activities in the previous 48 hours. The first thing they did was retrieve phone data, location history, text messages, calls, and social networks. Location records showed that Brayla left her home at around 6:30 p.m. on June 24, traveling to Sherwood, a quiet residential area northeast of Little Rock. The phone signal stopped at the same location as where the car was discovered. The single text message sent that afternoon, while not immediately noticeable, would later prove to be a crucial clue in tracking down the last person she had seen. As they searched through the list of people who had interacted closely with her, one name stood out: Trevone Hayes Miller, 20, of North Little Rock. According to phone records, Trevone's device was recorded traveling to the Sherwood area that evening, stopping around the time that Brayla was last seen. Their connection was not made public, but text messages showed that the two had been chatting for weeks, with increasing frequency. Some of the messages were guarded, especially from Trevone, suggesting he was worried about their relationship being discovered. The vague, cryptic messages made it impossible for investigators to ignore their suspicions. On July 6, 2020, Trevone was called in to meet with investigators as the last point of contact. The initial meeting was casual, and he appeared calm, but a series of questions about his location, time, and connection to Brayla began to make his confusion clear. Trevone claimed that he had been home that night and had not gone anywhere, but GPS data and network logs from his phone suggested otherwise. When asked why his signal matched where the car was found, Trevone was inconsistent in his explanation. These clues led the police to officially name him as a suspect and obtain a search warrant for his personal devices. Meanwhile, Brayla's friends began to share what they had heard from her. A close friend said that Brayla had said that someone was very afraid of others knowing about their connection, and that she felt unsafe if she continued texting. Though no names were mentioned, when comparing the content of the conversations, the emotions, and the timing, all eyes began to turn to Trevone. When the search warrant was approved, investigators discovered a series of recently deleted messages on Trevone's storage device, but recovered via the cloud sync system. These conversations showed that he and Brayla had planned to meet on the evening of June 24. In them, Trevone expressed anxiety, fearing that things would get out of hand if others knew he had a relationship with a transgender person. This detail led investigators to see the incident as not just intentional, but also complex psychological. On July 8, 2020, police executed an arrest warrant for Trevone Hayes Miller. He was charged with a felony and booked into the Pulaski County Detention Center. At the same time, the investigation was expanded to include additional witness testimony and digital evidence. One of the details considered a turning point came from the account of the manager at Trevone's workplace, a local fast food chain. According to the manager, Trevone called the day after the incident and said only one sentence: "I messed up. I may never come back." The meaning of those words at the time was not fully understood, but in the context of the case, it became a point of establishing the suspect's psychological state. At the same time, a social media post that appeared on the evening of June 24 was also included in the investigation. The anonymous post mentioned a payment for a supposed pay to do something involving a trans person in the Little Rock area. Although no name was mentioned, the details of the post were eerily similar to Brayla's information and the time of her disappearance. Police later determined there was insufficient evidence to directly link the post to Trevone, but it was kept on file because of its suspicious nature. Over several days of cross-referencing data, statements, and behavior, investigators were able to reconstruct a fairly complete timeline, from Brayla leaving the house to meeting Trevone to the time the phone stopped working. During the interview, Trevone never admitted to anything specific, but the more he remained silent, the more evidence emerged, like conversations, GPS signals, and denials that contradicted objective data. The investigative file grew every day, and the community began to follow the case with special attention, not only because of its seriousness, but also because it is one of the rare cases where the death of a young transgender person is investigated with such vigor and transparency. With all the pieces of the puzzle almost in place, the final question still hangs. What really happened in those hours of the night, between two people who shared conversations that were fraught with conflicting intimacy and avoidance? The answer will only come in court, where everything will be told, clearly, in the light of justice. The trial began in mid-August 2021 in a Pulaski County courtroom where windows cast light over rows of wooden benches, quiet and focused. On August 13, 2021, Trevone Hayes Miller, then 20, entered the courtroom as a defendant who had entered a plea bargain. The judge, Barry Sims, was in charge of sentencing. As the hearing began, the state's attorney offered a deal. Trevone would plead guilty to first-degree murder in exchange for a reduced capital murder charge, with a penalty of death or life in prison without the possibility of parole. Although no detailed testimony from the defendant was made public, court documents presented a series of compelling evidence about the time, location, and motive of the crime. The prosecution argued that this action was to prevent Brayla Stone from revealing a secret relationship involving the defendant's sexuality and personal honor. After the prosecution's argument, the defense attorneys then made their case. They mentioned Trevone's young age, the psychological factors and social pressures, and the desire to keep face in the eyes of others. They asked for special circumstances to mitigate the sentence. However, the judge did not stop there. He pointed out the seriousness of the loss of a young person, the widespread grief in the community, and the great influence of punishment to maintain deterrence. After some deliberation, the court sentenced him to a total of 50 years in prison, 40 years for first-degree murder, plus 10 years aggravated for using a weapon. The ruling means Trevone will be eligible for parole after serving at least 35 years, a long sentence that reflects the harshness of the legal system's approach to the case. The sentence not only brings closure to a heartbreaking case, but also sends a clear message. Actions that erase differences or hide one's identity will not be tolerated. In the immediate aftermath of the verdict, the LGBTQ+ community in Arkansas and across the country reacted strongly. Organizations like the Human Rights Campaign spoke out, stressing that this country failed Brayla and that the fight must continue to protect the most vulnerable. In Little Rock, many people wearing red and purple scarves, symbolizing courage and remembrance, gathered in silence to honor the young woman's death. On social media, the hashtag #JusticeForBrayla spread like wildfire, expressing outrage at the loss, as well as an urgent call for education, anti-gender discrimination, and identity understanding. Posts sharing images of her smiling face before her pain faded moved viewers and made them wonder about a more just society. The end of the trial was a wake-up call. The law had spoken, justice had been established, and society could no longer turn its back on stories like Brayla's. Viewers, listeners, and those who listened carried a sense of sadness, one that was hard to forget. No one can predict the last time a person will see, text, or be called by their real name. For Brayla Stone, those moments came much sooner than anyone who knew her imagined. A 17-year-old girl, living authentically, living beautifully, and bravely walking a path that not everyone has the confidence to choose. The loss lies not only in the silence of an empty chair, but also in the future that has not yet blossomed, in the things Brayla could have become but will never have the chance. The family lost a child, friends lost an inspiration, and society perhaps lost a rare piece of courage in a world full of prejudice. The case is over, the verdict is announced, but the lingering questions remain. How do we protect a young person who dares to live authentically? How can death not become a prerequisite for us to start caring? Brayla's story is not just a criminal case, but also a direct snapshot of today's society, where people are still vulnerable because of their identity. It raises urgent questions about gender education, about kindness and how we view others, and about listening before judging. If a community cannot keep its most vulnerable safe, are we really a community? So, in the end, will we remember Brayla as a victim or as a reminder? And will her name one day become a symbol of change? Not because of what she lost, but because of what we learned from that loss.